Call this hearing to order. Welcome. This is our first hearing this Congress of the Subcommittee on Consumer Protection, Product Safety, and Data Security. Delighted to be doing this work and for the opportunity to work closely with Ranking Member Blackburn. I'd like to wish her a happy birthday week. I think it was a couple days ago, but we celebrated in our family the whole week as your birthday week. I look forward to working with Senator Blackburn and make sure that this is a bipartisan effort to make progress on issues that are within the jurisdiction of this subcommittee, ranging from strong privacy protections for all Americans, strengthening our data security of connected devices that we depend on every day, identifying safe guardrails for emerging uses of artificial intelligence. I think that'll get a lot of attention. And obviously, so much more. With every step we take, we're always going to try to keep hardworking Americans living their lives, make sure that as consumers, they are first in our mind. Today, we're going to discuss increasing price transparency for consumers within the marketplace, writ broadly, all the marketplaces. We all know that junk fees can be frustrating for consumers when they shop for products and for services. They raise costs, and in many cases, they create confusion. But what does a junk fee look like? How does it feel? Simply put, these are fees that are disclosed to a consumer midway through or at the end of a transaction. Or they're fees that serve no tangible purpose for a consumer, like a processing fee, and that they are mandatory or unavoidable. The Council of Economic Advisors, the CEA, has found that junk fees limit the ability of consumers to comparison shop between service providers and reduce competition between merchants. Companies need to give consumers the transparency they deserve when they shop for goods or services. Price transparency allows for consumers to see the total price for a product or service from the get-go so they don't feel deceived. Allows for the consumer to see additional service charges that add to the overall price up front, but so they're not midway or at the end of a transaction when they find out about it. Behind me, we have a common example of purchasing a ticket for an event. On the first row, the ticket price displayed is $140 plus fees. No way to see or understand what the fees are until you go through the checkout process. Oh, I've ripped the wrong paper. Anyway, here we see an almost there transparency or example of how upfront and all-in transparency looks. All the fees are listed below the actual ticket price. Compared with the first example, imagine trying to buy tickets for a family of 6, and the total cost ends up being almost $200 more than advertised. Here's an example. It's not really ripping. Of total upfront pricing where you'll pay at checkout, where it's displayed before you even select the ticket. This way, consumers are informed with the crystal clear price that they'll pay for the product or service at checkout, and not a penny more. Last month, we had the pleasure of discussing methods to increase price transparency for consumers with the director of the National Economics Council, Dr. Lael Brainerd. Today, we're going to continue that conversation by hearing from our witness panel, and I hope and believe this will continue that effort. By working together, we can fairly promote the upfront all-in pricing across all sectors. Already bipartisan legislation has been introduced to increase price transparency for consumers in certain sectors. Surely more legislation is on the horizon. Senators are going to have the chance to discuss those efforts today. As a former small business owner, I experienced firsthand the many obstacles one encounters in opening a new brew pub or new restaurant or literally any small business. Small businesses up and down Main Street live and breathe on fair competition in order to keep the lights on and in order to serve their customers, deliver what their customers desire. Today, large companies use their market advantage to force customers into paying fees that were not expected or simply unavoidable. Consumers' pockets and small businesses suffer as a result. Businesses need to play by the same rules to create a level playing field that gives everyone an equal chance to compete fairly. And I think consumers will always be the major beneficiaries of such a system. As our economy continues to recover from the pandemic, we need to ensure American consumers have the information to make every dollar count. Let's be clear about what this hearing is not about. It's not about setting price caps for products or services. It's not about telling private companies how they should operate their business. I'd like to welcome each of our witnesses who are joining us today. Sally Greenberg, the CEO for the National Consumers League. Todd Zawicki, Professor of Law, George Mason University, Antonin Scalia Law School. And on Zoom, Vicki Morwitz, Professor of Business, Columbia Business School. I now recognize Ranking Member Blackburn for her opening remarks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I am so pleased that we are having our first hearing, and I really do look forward to working with you on issues where we have so much agreement. Kids Online Safety Act, data privacy, data security, artificial intelligence, and preventing the sale of dangerous and counterfeit products online. As we had discussed previously, I was really a bit surprised by the administration and now this committee's focus on so-called junk fees. When I'm in Tennessee, the economy is what is at the top of the list that things that people are talking about. They aren't talking about junk fees. What they are talking about is the price of the gas pump, the grocery store, how high these electric bills are going, and they're concerned about skyrocketing inflation on the basket of goods that they purchase and use every single day. And they're worried about the out-of-control spending. The debt deal was very unpopular in Tennessee because it doesn't rein in what this government and this administration is spending. And American families, Tennessee families, want answers to those problems, and they really don't want to hear bureaucrats in Washington or legislators discussing resort fees and food delivery fees for DoorDash or Uber Eats. So this is the way I look at this issue and the way many Tennesseans look at it is this is another way for the FTC, the CFPB, DOT, and all these regulators to clamp down on businesses and try to micromanage businesses. Now, are these fees annoying? Absolutely, they are. Should companies be more transparent in how they bring the fees forward? And absolutely, they should do that. And consumers themselves should be more willing to walk away and use only businesses that are operating on the up and up, that are going to disclose these fees. But we have to remember this. These are not monopolies. These are hotels and airlines and banks and online retailers, and competition matters to these companies. And we see that competition making an impact on the marketplace every single day. So thank you to our witnesses. I'm looking forward to a good, frank discussion today. Appreciate your getting your testimony in a timely manner. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Great. Thank you, Senator Blackburn. Now we can look forward to, we'll let each of our witnesses do their introductory remarks. Why don't we start with Vicki Morwitz, who's a professor of business at Columbia Business School. You're on.
Great. Thank you very much. Good morning. My name is Vicki Morwitz. I'm the Bruce Greenwald Professor of Business and Professor of Marketing at Columbia Business School at Columbia University. Thank you for inviting me to testify on the issue of protecting consumers from junk fees. I'm a consumer psychologist with expertise in how consumers process additional fees and surcharges, a topic I've studied for over 25 years. I've discussed this research in my classes, and I've given research seminars on this topic at universities around the world. In my testimony, I'll discuss two pricing practices that I've studied in depth that are central to the discussions taking place today: partition pricing and drip pricing. The academic research on both partition and drip pricing makes clear that consumers make better informed decisions when firms use all-inclusive pricing. My co-authors and I define partition pricing as a strategy where firms decide to divide a product's price into two or more mandatory parts, a base price for the main product and one or more mandatory surcharges, rather than charging a single all-inclusive price. For example, many hotels assess a mandatory fee on top of the daily room rate. These are sometimes called resort fees or facility fees or destination fees and can range from $20 to over $50 a night. And many rental car agencies assess several mandatory fees on top of the daily rental rate, such as concession recovery fees, customer facility fees, energy recovery fees, and vehicle licensing fees. In general, what research on partition pricing has shown is that when firms separate out mandatory surcharges, consumers tend to underestimate the total price they'll have to pay, and they're often more likely to complete the purchase. While these effects happen even when the surcharges are fully disclosed, the detrimental effects are even larger when the surcharges are hidden in the small print and when they're made more difficult for consumers to process, such as when they're framed as a percent of the base price versus as a flat dollar amount. My co-authors and I have also studied a related pricing strategy called drip pricing. With drip pricing, firms advertise only part of a product's price up front and reveal other charges later as shoppers go through the buying process. Dripped fees can be mandatory or can be for optional items, but for today's testimony, I'll focus on the dripping of mandatory surcharges. Drip pricing is commonly used in industries like the cable TV and the ticketing industries. When a consumer shops for a TV internet bundle from a cable television provider, they may first see an attractive base price offer for the bundle, but later learn there are also broadcast TV fees, set-top box fees, regional sports fees, and TV connection fees that raise the price considerably. And a consumer shopping for a ticket for a live event like a concert, a play, or a baseball game typically first sees the price for different seats in the venue. After selecting a seat, as the consumer clicks through more web pages, they may come to learn there's also a mandatory booking fee, ticketing fee, venue fee, and delivery fee, even when the tickets are delivered electronically. Eventually, they see a total price that may be much higher than the first price they saw, and they may be under time pressure to complete the purchase, as there might be a countdown clock that indicates they have to complete their purchase in just a few minutes, or they may be told there's only 2 seats left at that price. What research has shown is that when surcharges are dripped, consumers end up being more likely to buy a product that appears cheaper up front based only on the base price, but that's more expensive in total given the drip fees. Consumers also tend to buy more expensive products than they otherwise would are dripped, such as a seat closer to the stage for a live event. Notably, these effects happen even when consumers are provided with a total price at the final stage of the transaction before they complete their purchase. While in theory, they can cancel the purchase when they see that the total is more expensive than they first thought, they often don't, because they tend to overestimate the cost of restarting search and underestimate the benefits of doing so. Because of this, it's not enough to show the total price to avoid the detrimental effects of drip pricing. Research has also shown that these effects don't go away with purchase experience. For example, repeat ticket buyers are still affected by drip pricing, similar to first-time buyers. And it's not because consumers are stupid or even careless that they're affected by the separation and dripping of mandatory surcharges. In general, consumers try to make good decisions for themselves and their families. But pricing practices like drip and partition pricing take advantage of the fact that we consumers have a lot going on in our lives. We're busy and can be distracted. And because of that, we may not notice or appropriately consider all information important to that purchase decision, especially when that information is hidden in the small print, is presented in obscure language, or is dripped late in the shopping process. Academic research has shown that partitioned and drip pricing leads consumers to spend more money than they intended to or needed to, and make choices that don't reflect their true desires or preferences. What the research on these pricing practices also makes clear is that consumers benefit when all-inclusive upfront pricing is used rather than when fees are dripped later in the shopping process or disclosed in multiple parts. As a scholar who studied these pricing practices for decades and who knows well how their use can be detrimental to consumers and to honest businesses, I strongly advocate that policy be promoted that addresses the partitioning and dripping of surcharges like we commonly see in so many industries. These policies will benefit consumers if they require that upfront stated prices must be all-inclusive. In other words, that all mandatory fees must be included in the total price and that the total price should be seen upfront. This is what academic research suggests will be most beneficial to consumers. Thank you for the opportunity to appear today at this hearing. I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have.
Thank you, Ms. Morowitz. Appreciate you taking the time to be with us. Next, let's turn to Todd Zywicki, who's a professor of law at George Mason University Law School.
Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Blackburn, it's a pleasure to be here with you today. I've run into junk fees myself. I know what the instinct is. I got tricked into one of these on vacation in Florida a little while back, and so I understand exactly what's going on here. But I think the most important thing here is to keep in mind the situations under which this could be a problem and situations where it is not. And I want to just briefly make 3 points, which is the first is to talk about the situations in which this can occur and be a market failure. Second, talk about the more important and more generalizable situation in which multi-part pricing is efficient and prevents cross-consumer subsidies and inefficiencies in pricing. And third, I want to talk about situations in which regulation itself is the cause of a proliferation of fees and can end up harming consumers, and some examples that are going on. So let's talk first about when there can be a market failure, when this can happen. We just heard from Professor Morowitz of these problems of drip pricing and the like, but this primarily happens in particular context, which is where we have non-repeat consumers who don't learn over time, and situations where they don't really have an alternative to. So an obvious example is mandatory fees. Like the mandatory resort fees we heard about. That's what happened to me, which is I booked online, I showed up at the hotel. At the last page at some point among the list of costs was a $30 resort fee. I had to whip up my credit card when I got there. I thought I had prepaid, right? If it's a mandatory fee, it should be at least strongly presumptively part of the overall price, not something that is broken out. Ticket fees, I agree completely, Mr. Chairman. Those sorts of things where you have to click, where even though you know there's going to be a fee on the back end, you've got to click through 6-8 screens in order to find out what the heck the fee is going to be. I don't see if it's going to be mandatory. I think presumptively it should be part of the overall price. But on the other hand, we see situations where it's also predatory. So take this growing practice of credit card surcharging, which has been allowed. Merchants can give cash discounts. Cash discounts, the option of getting a cash discount is pro-consumer. The option of a merchant imposing a credit card surcharge at the end of a transaction is one of the most anti-consumer policies I've ever seen. And the reason is they impose it in situations where you really don't have an alternative to using a credit card, whether it's online, whether it's in a vacation area, basically the same places like resort fees. And so we used to have credit card surcharging was outlawed, cash discounting has always been allowed. And I think that's really something that should be explored, and I think it's very disappointing that a lot of consumer activist groups actually are lobbying in favor and support this idea of credit card surcharging, which is a really pernicious practice. Those are the situations where this can happen. In general, though, fees, multi-part pricing prevents cross-consumer subsidies and requires consumers to pay for the things they get. Additional toppings on pizza, for example. I don't think anybody has objection to that. Paying for first class and the like. Paying late fees, at least traditionally, people understood that paying late fees for people who pay late on credit cards would be an appropriate way of pricing risk, although apparently that's in question now. It's often the case, though, we can have efficient combinations of prices. So in the airline market, for example, everybody knows bags fly free on Southwest. Everybody knows bags don't fly free on the legacy airlines. Everybody knows there's going to be a fee for bags on the other airlines and the like. Maybe there's ways you can disclose it, but nobody's fooled at this point. And so that's obviously pricing for certain services. As I talk about in my testimony, there's aspects of that that are driven by the way taxes are assessed and that sort of thing. But most of what we see in markets is an alignment of prices with what with the costs that consumers impose. Where I think is particularly problematic is the third category, which is where we get unbundling as a result of regulation. The Durbin Amendment to Dodd-Frank is a good example of this. By imposing price controls on interchange fees, we took away free checking, we took away simple free checking bank accounts from millions of Americans, particularly low-income Americans. Now we get multi-part pricing with high monthly fees, an elimination of annual fees, and other prices that adjusted as a result of that. The Credit Card Act did the same thing by controlling the ability to place risk. Risk got repriced. The RESPA rule that I talk about in my testimony that forces unbundling and the like and ends up driving up costs. And so a lot of the proposals on the table right now, such as the CFPB's late fees rule, would be harmful to consumers by interfering with this risk-based pricing. The proposal to extend the Durbin Amendment to credit card would be disastrous for consumers and take away free credit cards from consumers. I see I'm over my time. I look forward to taking any questions you have. Thank you.
Great, Chair. Thank you, Mr. Zawicki. Now we go to Sally Greenberg as the CEO of National Consumers League.
Good morning, Chairman Hickenlooper, Ranking Member Blackburn, and members of the subcommittee. My name is Sally Greenberg, and I'm the CEO of the National Consumers League. We were founded in 1899. We are America's pioneering consumer and worker advocacy organization. And my organization has worked for many years to try to raise awareness about the impact of hidden fees and junk fees and promote transparency in the marketplace. American companies are, in a word, addicted to junk fees. Junk fees come in many forms, encompassing a wide range of unfair or deceptive charges. They are, by definition, often unnecessary, unavoidable, or surprising charges that inflate costs while adding little or no value to a product or service. They include fees that a reasonable consumer assumes are included in the overall advertised price. Mandatory hotel resort fees that Professor Zawicki just mentioned are one such fee that comes to mind. Americans, be they Republican or Democrat, hate junk fees. A 2019 survey by Consumer Reports found that at least 85% of Americans have encountered an unexpected or hidden fee for a service they used in the past 2 years. And a recent Morning Consult poll found that 80% of Democrats, 71% of independents, and 73% of Republicans support congressional action to rein in abusive junk fees in industries like live ticketing and cell phone, cable TV, and internet services. So, if consumers hate junk fees so much, why do companies, large and small, increasingly impose them? The answer is, unsurprisingly, because they are a substantial profit center. The marketplace is inundated with junk fees, from hotels to car rentals to utilities to apartments to investments to auto and home lending. The list of industries that impose junk fees is virtually endless. The Wall Street Journal recently found one hotel in Las Vegas that even charged a $3.50 fee for so-called craft ice. That said, a few industries stand out as serial abusers. Let's start with banks. Late payment fees charged by banks on credit cards cost American families an estimated $12 billion annually. These fees, which can be as much as $41 for each late fee payment, far exceed the cost to the issuer for processing and do little to deter future delinquent payments. Airlines are also poster children for junk fees. Globally, revenue from junk fees, ancillary fees in airline speak, brought in $102.8 billion in 2022. To put this in perspective, junk fees last year made up 15% of global airline revenues, compared to 6% only 10 years ago. And anyone who buys tickets to a concert or sporting event is well acquainted with the myriad fees that are added at the end of the ticket buying process. We had the example that you showed, Senator Hickenlooper. Primary and secondary market ticketing companies charge service fees, order processing fees, delivery fees, and other charges that increase ticket prices on average 27% for the primary market and 31% for the secondary market. Junk fees cause significant economic harm, and in particular, they cause harm to those of modest means. Renters, for example, tend to have lower incomes than those who own their homes. These consumers are also some of the most preyed upon by abusive junk fees. A 2022 survey conducted by consumer and housing advocates found that 89% of landlords impose rental application fees. Nearly as many renters paid excessive late fees, and they also get hit with utility, administrative, convenience, insurance, and notice fees. Competition has not and will not make junk fees go away. This is because junk fees themselves are anti-competitive. They make comparing prices more difficult, distorting well-functioning marketplaces. Honest entrepreneurs who invest in their businesses, innovate, and strive to create better value for their customers lose business. Action to address the consumer and competitive harm created by junk fees is urgently needed. First, we would urge you to support S916. It's the Junk Fee Prevention Act, which would require some of the worst abusers of junk fees to display the full price of services up front, and it would bar excessive fees and ensure transparency. Second, we ask that Congress restore the FTC's ability to obtain strong financial penalties from wrongdoers. The Supreme Court in 2021 overturned the AMG Capital Management versus FTC, wiping out a critical enforcement tool for the Commission. S4145, which is the Consumer Protection Remedies Act, would restore that ability to impose monetary relief to the Commission. And finally, Congress must not allow businesses that trap consumers with unfair and deceptive fees to escape accountability through fine print in their contracts. To that end, we're proud to support S1376, the Forced Arbitration and Justice Repeal Act, which would prohibit pre-dispute arbitration agreements from being enforceable if they require arbitration in employment, consumer, antitrust, or civil rights disputes. Chairman Hickenlooper and Ranking Member Blackburn, Senator Cantwell, Senator Lujan, Senator Welch, thank you so much for inviting the National Consumers League and the consumer perspective into this discussion. We appreciate your holding the hearing, and we look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you, Ms. Greenberg. I appreciate you being here as well. I'm going to turn over for the first set of questions to Senator Cantwell, who's the chair of the Commerce Committee. She's got a busier day than I do.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair Hickenlooper. I want to thank you and Ranking Member Blackburn for convening this important hearing. Like many of you, I am frustrated by what is happening in the marketplace. In my home state of Washington, exorbitant hidden fees recently made news when the price of a home ticket to watch the Seattle Kraken play the Dallas Stars in Game 3 of the NHL playoff cost more than it would to just fly to Dallas. At the time, Cairo 7 reported that the cheapest resale ticket available was $294, or at least that's the price the platform would have you think, after a $61 ticket processing fee and a $3 order processing fee. The real price of the ticket before tax was $358, an extra 22% on top of the advertised price. We've all encountered these junk fees in one form or another, and these are mandatory fees that are not included in the advertising price, providing no recognizable value to the consumers, and we're hearing obviously from our witnesses about this today. The bottom line is we can't make comparison shopping harder. We can't reduce competition, and we don't want to see things that distort the market. That is why Senator Cruz and I introduced the Ticket Act, which has been addressed here by some of our witnesses. The price, they say, really should be the price you pay. And that can be added to, but it needs to be disclosed. So I wanted to, if I could, I think I know the answer listening to some of the testimony here, but Professor Zizwicki, I didn't hear all of your testimony. Do you agree that the principle of all mandatory fees for goods and services should be disclosed in an upfront price?
As I said, well, first, I succeeded Senator Cruz as the director of the Office of Policy Planning at the Federal Trade Commission, so it's likely we agree on a lot. And this is one on which I think we agree, which is, as I said, I can't see any reason why that wouldn't be disclosed up front. And so in general, I think that's the right approach and would generally agree with that.
So why, Ms. Greenberg, I heard your answer, yes. You can reiterate it if you want. But why do you think this is so important not just with ticket sellers, but the true price overall, including mandatory fees. Why do you think this is so important? What complexity does that bring to the market when you have this level of distortion?
Well, first off, consumers can't comparison shop because they don't know what the end-all and an all-in price is going to be. So it distorts the market from that perspective. But as Professor Morowitz described, it's a rabbit hole for consumers. They go, they click and they click and they click on various price options, and they end up spending more money than they would if they were an all-in price. So there's some psychology involved, I think, in the businesses that impose these prices. But consumers are angry about it, and they feel like they get trapped into paying for goods and services with these add-on fees that they had not expected, but they end up doing it because it's easier for them to just pay it rather than balk at or look around for competition.
Thank you. Professor Zwicky, Ms. Greenberg mentioned the Supreme Court case that struck down part of the FTC's authority. We had FTC members here, both Democrat and Republican nominees. They all said we needed to replace that. Do you think we need to replace that to give consumers a fair deal?
I would have to, I'm not prepared to give an opinion on that
We
today,
can give
thanks.
you a question for the record, and you can give us an answer.
Sure, I'll
in
think more
writing.
about that.
Yes, thank you so much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Now, in full faith to alternating between Republicans and Democrats, I will yield my primary position of asking questions to Senator Blackburn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Professor Zwicky, I want to come to you and thank you, all three of you, each of you, for your testimony. As I said in my opening, I'm not hearing from Tennesseans about junk fees. They're just not talking about, they are talking about real economic harm. And I think for some, it's been kind of perplexing that we would focus on this issue. I even had one Tennessean say, well, what exactly is a junk fee? And what are the economic harms that come to people for fees for discretionary services? So why don't you take that question and just say, what is the economic harm that comes? And why would this term of junk fee be applied to fees that are for discretionary services?
Thanks. I appreciate the question. Junk fees is obviously a term of rhetoric. There's no, it's a meaningless term. It's just a matter of rhetoric. We have concepts like Professor Morowitz said of trip pricing, multi-part pricing, partition pricing. Those are actually real concepts, right? Junk fees is just a conclusory label.
I think that's why it is perplexing to Tennesseans and to so many people, why we would make this a primary point of contention rather than looking at DOT and some of the issues that exist with the airlines, or looking at other forms of service. If people pay their credit card late, they expect to pay a late fee.
And that's the important point, is this vaguely defined concept of junk fees sweeps a lot of things into it, things that can be oppressive to consumers like mandatory resort fees. But what it seems to reach is a lot more other things now, the way this is done. For example, as you mentioned, the credit card late fees. I can't see any reason why people who pay their credit cards on time should have to subsidize people who pay their credit cards late. The evidence is clear on this from the Grodzicki study that if you reduce late fees, more people pay late. The Massoud study makes clear that if you reduce late fees, everybody ends up paying higher interest rates, and lower income and higher risk borrowers get less access to credit. So most of what we see in the market is efficient. It prevents cross-consumer subsidies, and a lot of these things that are labeled as junk fees are actually just efficient multi-part pricing.
In Tennessee, we are a fast-growing state. This weekend is CMA Fest in Nashville. We're going to have a lot of people that are visiting there. The Great Smoky Mountains are the most visited national park in our national park system. So when you look at people choosing these destinations, and then you look at a mandatory regulation on hotel fees and some of the resort fees. So talk a little bit about the risk of government intervention, of mandating certain fees for some of these services and the impact that'll have on tourism.
Yeah, and that's an important point, which is you're going to. I'm always cautious about mandating things, and certainly cautious about mandating new disclosures because people already have too many disclosures, right? What we do know about resort fees and the like is only about 6 to 7% of hotels actually assess resort fees. They're overwhelmingly in places like Las Vegas or Orlando, and they fit this particular thing that I'm talking about, which is that they are generally not repeat purchasers, and so consumers don't learn from it and that sort of thing, and so they can raise the cost of price comparison to the extent, though, that they are mandatory, that everybody has to pay them. Then it seems to me that they're largely part of the price. I think one thing we could also think about is incentives to provide discounts rather than surcharging. And I'll go back to the example, which is merchants want to surcharge credit cards now because it's clear they want to extract wealth from consumers and give them a low upfront price and then slap them with a credit card on the back end. They charge credit card surcharge in the same context in which hotels charge resort fees. A cash discount is a totally different story, which is if you charge a higher price and then give somebody a cash discount if they don't use a service or if they don't use a credit card or something like that, that then allows the comparison pricing, but then also allows consumers to opt out. You have to make that obviously easy enough for them to do it. So mandating certain things that can be done in different ways as well.
Okay, so in other words, you would say provide more choice and options rather than mandating everything be rolled into one price.
Yeah, I think that these prices tend to evolve over time. So, for example, cell phones used to have a lot of disparate pricing, and now just because consumers demanded it, it's become all-in pricing. Prepaid cards had the same effect, and so they tend to vary over time. But there's nothing inconsistent with having United and Southwest both offering different services and different packages. And the empirical evidence indicates Southwest charges a little bit more for a ticket than United because they've decided to forego these fees. I love Southwest. I always fly Southwest, right? But people pay a little bit more for a ticket on Southwest than they do in United when you unbundle it. And so allowing that option is generally, I think, is efficient.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Just following that, Professor Zawicki, so that when you were talking about what appears almost like a surcharge when someone has to pay more when they use their credit card, isn't what we're really talking about here transparency? In other words, as long as the consumer knows up ahead of time whether they're going to a hotel in Las Vegas or a hotel in Denver, they should have some sense if they're going to be added costs. Is that fair to say?
Yes, if there will be added costs.
I mean, transparency, I think, is the one connecting thing. I look at them, I think junk fees sometimes is the wrong term because it does sound pejorative. Maybe surprise fees is another way of looking at it. But either way, I think most people find it very objectionable.
That's right. And, the logic here is we want to try to bundle, we want to have all-in pricing, right? Rather than here's the price and now here's the additional price if you use a credit card, right? And so to be coherent about this, I think we want to think about sort of when we want to have all-in pricing and when unbundling is appropriate. Transparency is just a means to an end, I think, of consumers finding the right mix of goods, services, and prices that they're looking for. So.
Right. And let me ask each of you a question, just kind of get it on the record, that some services are offered to consumers as an option, additional cost, an optional additional cost, but obviously certain fees are generally of an administrative sort, are mandatory for consumers in order to purchase the product or service. So if you can, just a simple yes or no, should all mandatory fees be included in the initial advertised price?
Yes, certainly.
I think generally, yes.
Professor Morowitz?
I agree, yes.
Yeah, because I think that's, again, part of this the essential question here is how transparent is the transaction from the beginning? Professor Morowitz, small businesses are the backbone of our country and the backbone of our economy. They prioritize serving their customers and drive economic growth in rural and urban areas alike. If every company displayed all-in upfront pricing to consumers, small and large businesses would have a more level playing field on which to compete. I look at this again as the cost of hidden prices. That's not only that they mislead consumers, but they also put small businesses at a disadvantage against larger competitors. So, Dr. Morowitz, would you describe how hidden junk fees hurt small businesses when you're in the process of competing for customers?
Yes, I'd be happy to. When a larger firm, or when really any firm uses hidden fees or surcharges, it doesn't only hurt consumers, but it hurts well-intentioned, honest competitors like many of our country's small businesses that you're talking about. So when a larger firm makes salient a lower base price and only puts in small print or only reveals at the end of the shopping process that there are additional mandatory fees, their product offerings may appear, at least at first, to be cheaper than those of, say, a small business, an honest competitor who uses all-inclusive prices, whose prices, at least at first, then will appear more expensive, even if they're actually cheaper in total when the hidden fees of the large firm are added in. Now, research shows this is going to lead consumers to be more likely to even first consider the products and services of the larger firm who uses hidden surcharges because their products seem cheaper. In other words, their supposed low prices draw consumers in. But then, having first considered their products, consumers will also be more likely to stick with that firm and ultimately purchase their products, even when they're more expensive in total with the fees. So these hidden fees, they don't only hurt consumers by leading them to make purchases that are against their own self-interest, but it also hurts honest competitors who are using transparent pricing practices. They also make it difficult for a firm maybe who's currently using hidden fees but realizes it's wrong and wants to stop to move away from doing so, because if they move to all-inclusive pricing but their competitors don't, they'll lose market share. So all of this ultimately hurts honest small businesses who compete for customers against a larger firm that has kind of perfected and capitalized on the use of hidden fees.
Great, thank you very much. And Ms. Greenberg, certain sectors, as we've heard, such as aviation, already display upfront pricing, excludes additional fees like baggage or seats, but people are aware of that and they are informed of that prior to purchase or in the process of purchase. In other sectors, companies have started displaying all-in upfront pricing to consumers, but companies have adopted this unevenly, let's say. I think, all agree that customers benefit from transparent upfront pricing. How could federal legislation encourage upfront pricing to consumers evenly and fairly across all sectors?
Well, first of all, we're talking about posting mandatory fees, all-in pricing on the final cost of the service or product. Secondly, there are legislative fixes. The junk fees bill that was introduced would go a long way toward addressing the excessive imposition of junk fees on consumers. Third, consumers would benefit from the Congress acting on the recent decision by the Supreme Court to overturn the FTC's ability to impose monetary penalties for unfair and deceptive practices. So those are three steps that could take. There's other pieces of legislation that we support that are before this committee. We think would go a long way to righting the wrongs against consumers.
Great, thank you. I'm going to turn now to Senator Klobuchar, our ace eagle on transparency.
And especially that description, Senator Hickenlooper. As you are all aware, we held a major hearing in the Judiciary Committee, and I'm also pleased that the Commerce Committee has jurisdiction as well and involved in this. We have seen, it has been pointed out, increased costs on everything from cell phone bills to airplane and concert tickets. And one area of this high excessive fees is ticketing. We had the hearing earlier this year with the president of Live Nation Ticketmaster. and other witnesses. And as you are aware, the facts are quite startling. It's being reviewed by the Justice Department, including 90% monopoly on ticketing for major NFL, NHL events, 80% for major arena events, and 70% monopoly when it comes to all ticketing. In addition to that, Ticketmaster now owns a number of venues and also locks in the number of other venues that they don't own with their services for in excess of 7 years, which is the subject of a bill that Senator Blumenthal and I have introduced. Because of this locking in makes for even less competition. And then finally, Live Nation promotes the act. So it's like a three-cornered monopoly. So Justice Department is investigating, and then we go from there when it comes to other consumer bills that are being considered. In 2018, the GAO found that on average concert ticket fees cost 27% of the ticket's face value, but there have also been reports recently of fees totaling 75% of the face value of tickets. Ms. Moritz, in your testimony, you discuss how drip pricing is commonly used in the ticketing industry for live events and concert. Could you talk about that and how that misrepresents the true cost of buying a ticket?
Yes, thank you for the question. So when fees are presented at the end of the shopping process, it makes the initial price look cheaper. So the customer starts, they see the price for a particular seat they would like for the event, the play, the baseball game, and it appears cheaper than it really is. As they click through the pages, they learn that there's a series of fees that they have to pay. And at the end, the price is much more expensive, as you mentioned. 20%, 50%, maybe 75%. They see the total, and in theory, they could back out at that point. But it becomes very difficult for consumers to do so. The tendency is to stick with the price, even though it's more expensive than they thought it was initially. And there's a variety of reasons why that happens. Often they overestimate how much time it would take to start over. They underestimate how much money they could save by starting over. They have to notice the fees in the first place. They may not even notice the fees. And also, we don't like to feel bad as consumers, so we might sort of have a self-motivated component where we want to feel like we made a good decision. So for all these reasons, consumers tend not to start over again. Also, the ticketing the firms, they also put pressure on the consumer to complete the deal. So there might be a countdown clock. And if we're under time pressure, we feel like we need to make the decision quickly.
Right. Good
there
point.
might be messages of scarcity, that there's 2 tickets left at that price. And we feel like if I restart, I might lose these good seats.
Thank you. Very good.
You're welcome.
Ms. Greenberg, could you talk about how increased transparency of showing fans the full ticket price up front could help create a more functional market? I know Mr. Zwicky agrees that it is important to show the fees up front. Could you talk about that?
Yeah, it is important. And we saw this coming when the merger of Live Nation and Ticketmaster happened in the Justice Department. This is going to create an impossible monopolistic situation, and it is exactly what's happened for consumers. All-in pricing is so important because when you look for a ticket online, you can't tell until you get to the very end of the transaction how much that ticket's going to cost you. And different secondary markets, primary markets have different charges. You can't compare and contrast. And as Professor Morwitz said, most consumers are going to go, well, I've spent 20 minutes getting this ticket. I'm just going to finish up. What's $5? What's $10? So all-in pricing is critical so that you can compare and contrast. I also want to mention that this is not just about middle class, the junk fee, not just about middle class consumers. Poor people of very modest means are facing punishing fees in so many areas. Renters, for example, have 6, 7 different fees that are imposed on they have to pay a fee to even get a rental application in. They can least afford it, and I know Senator Blackburn was saying our consumers aren't concerned about this. They're concerned about basic goods and services. Well, that affects people of low income harder than any of the rest of us. So I think it's important that we recognize that we're talking about middle class consumers, consumers of more modest means. These fees are hitting all of us across the board, and they are out of control right now.
Very good. Thank you. And I will ask on the record some of the App Store issues of you, Ms. Morwitz, because I'm out of time. Another piece of legislation that Senator Blackburn and Blumenthal and I have, and there's a lot of work to be done, and I'm very glad this is a priority of this committee, and I thank Senator Hickenlooper for his leadership. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Klobuchar. Now turn to Senator Markey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, our Denver Nugget.
What a glorious night it was last night.
Game last night. Airline fees are out of control, and some of them are simply unconscionable. It is absolutely infuriating that many airlines force consumers to pay extra just to sit with their young children. We've got to put a stop to this outrageous practice. I was thrilled to hear President Biden call on Congress to ban family seating fees during his State of the Union address, because I've been calling for that policy for years. Ms. Greenberg, do you agree that airlines should never force parents to pay to sit with their children?
Absolutely. We are fully supportive of the Fair Fees Act, which covers that practice. And no, of course, families shouldn't be required to be separated from their loved ones or pay extra fees. But your bill does address many of the problems with transparency in the airline industry, and we are very supportive of that legislation.
Thank you so much. And I obviously agree with that. That's why yesterday Senator Vance and I sent a letter to Chair Cantwell and Ranking Member Cruz with proposed language to be included in the FAA reauthorization bill to ban family sitting fees. A parent's right to sit next to their child is not a partisan issue. And would you support that language, Ms. Greenberg, being included in the FAA legislation?
Yes, certainly we would.
Thank you. Family seating fees may be the poster child for outrageous junk fees, but the airlines nickel and dime consumers in so many other ways. Baggage fees, boarding fees, seat selection fees, the list goes on and on. If it used to be a basic service on an airline, it probably costs money today. Ms. Greenberg, should Congress protect consumers from these never-ending fees?
We think Congress has an important role to play. Competition has not worked to diminish the fees. We did see the airlines back away from cancellation fees, and we are grateful for that. That was during COVID, and of course the COVID crisis really pushed that decision forward. And so though we appreciate that, there are so many fees related to flying. And I want to make the point that, yes, you may know that you have a baggage fee, but there are many people who are older, who have disabilities, who may have children with them. They cannot be carrying their bags onto the airplane. So they are forced to eat the cost of a $35 fee, something that used to be free before and has jammed our airplanes full of luggage up top, creating hazards for flight attendants as well.
And that's why we need to pass the Fair Fees Act, which would prohibit airlines from charging fees that are not reasonable and proportional to the cost of the services provided. And I want to turn to one other topic related to aviation, consumer protection, airport service workers. The Good Jobs for Good Airports Act, which I've introduced with Senator Blumenthal and Senator Schumer, would increase the wages and benefits for airport service workers like baggage handlers and wheelchair attendants. And we're fighting for this bill because it won't only repay the sacrifices that these workers made during the pandemic, it will also help consumers. Higher wages and benefits for airport service workers means lower turnover and better airport security and higher service quality. Ms. Greenberg, do you agree that the Good Jobs for Good Airports Act is ultimately a good pro-consumer bill?
Yes, we certainly support the Good Jobs for Airports Act. I think many consumers had no idea that a lot of these workers were not making minimum wage, were relying on tips, and many people who use the wheelchairs and baggage, use the baggage, the curbside baggage services, did not know that people were living on tipped wages, and many people don't tip as some of us who've been tipped workers know, tipping is very is very up and down and certainly not a reliable source of income. So yes, we very much appreciate that legislation, and it's long overdue.
And again, that would come as all new information to most people who fly, that these people are actually supposed to be tipped for all the services that they're providing. No one actually knows that, which is why we have to ensure legally that they get paid for what they deserve. And that's why we're going to continue to fight to include that legislation in the FAA reauthorization. Thank you, Ms. Greenberg. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator. I'll turn it over to Senator Welch.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. You know, the computer has been mastered by, in this case, the airlines, but a lot of people selling things, to be able, with their algorithms, to put a lot of pressure on people who are making a decision, let's say, to fly. I mean, that's a big deal for a family. Let's say there's a funeral, there's a wedding. They want to fly, or they're making a decision about whether to go to a place or even take a vacation, and they start to look at what the price is. And the question really is, if you get the upfront price, that family can make a decision based on their budget before they get totally emotionally committed to doing it. And a lot of people will say, oh, I can afford this, and then they'll get into it. And then as the fees pile up, they suddenly find themselves in a different place with a lot of anxiety. You know, there's a question here, not just about transparency, but the time of transparency. When does the person be told very concretely and specifically what the total cost will be? Which is really kind of a policy question, but my sense from talking to consumers is they'd like to know that sooner rather than later. I'll ask both of you to comment on that. And I'm thinking about that time frame where people have that clock ticking and they've got to push by or the whole thing goes away. Is there anything that we should be doing about that element of this? Ms. Greenberg, I'll ask you, and then Professor Zawicki.
Yeah, I think right up front information, including you're going to have to pay for baggage. You're going to have to pay to sit together if you're a family. If you want to sit closer to the front, maybe you have disability issues, or you have a stroller, you have babies with you. You should know that there's going to be.
There's two different areas too. There's a question of knowing up front, and then there's a question of what's reasonable and what's not. It's not reasonable, in my view, to make people pay to have a family sit together. I totally agree with Senator Markey. The baggage fee is different. I hate it. But if that's up front, you can calculate that into the cost. Professor Zawicki, any suggestions on how Congress should approach this?
Yeah, I'll say two things, which is first, I'll amplify that point. As I said, whenever possible, I fly Southwest simply because it's easier, right? I know I can worry about my bags later. If my plans change, I can change my plans. So there is some competition there. And as I said, I think people understand what's going on with bags, and there could be people who are affected more or less. One thing I will say that I've not looked at the cost of this, so I'm speaking a little bit out of order, but the idea of having 24 hours to cancel an airline ticket after you book it, I think that might be something that's worth exploring in this context, which is that if you have a transaction that has a back-end fee, you have 24 hours to cancel without penalty, for example, because sometimes it won't be till I get the confirmation email, for example, that I'll see something that I missed when I was booking it, or if I feel like it was rushed into something. If there's some way in which people could have, say, 24 hours like you can with an airplane ticket to be able to cancel the transaction. I don't know what the cost of that would be. I don't know how feasible that is, but that strikes me as one way of maybe getting it done.
Thank you. Do we know when somebody's booking an airline and you're trying to get the pricing, it says two left at this price? Is that true?
Well, what I can say is I have booked and then decided there's been situations I've booked and then had to rebook, because I had a credit in my account, right? And what I found is after I booked the last ticket at that price, when I went back in, to try to book it again was a higher price. So I don't know whether it's true or not, but at least sometimes it seems to be true. So.
Well, should there be an obligation on the part of the seller, an airline, to make certain that that is in fact true?
I would certainly agree. From a consumer perspective, you want to know if that's true, if that statement is based in fact. You see a lot of those in the ancillary services, the Expedias, the Travelocities will do, you've got only two tickets remaining at this price. I certainly wouldn't trust it as based in fact, and I think it's false advertising and should be
Thank you.
pursued.
That seems like an unfair trade practice to me, instinctively.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Sullivan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the witnesses being here. It's an important topic. Thank you for sharing this. I guess for both of the witnesses at the table here, one of the issues that I think that we're all not struggling with, but trying to nail down better is just how you define junk fees. And it's not easily definable. So Professor Zawicki, is that right? Can you take a crack at that? What I want to make sure is that the ones that are junk fees, we go after. The ones that are fees, I think the key on other kind of fees is transparency. But maybe the two of you can help us with regarding junk fees, and then the definition, and then I have kind of a follow-up on what you think economically their impact is, which I think is also an important issue. You want to take a crack at that, Professor?
Sure. Junk fees is a meaningless term, but it's worse than meaningless. It's actually pernicious, which is that by sort of using this blanket conclusory label, it obscures the complexity of this, the difference between drip pricing, risk-based pricing, multi-part pricing, partition pricing, and that sort of thing. And it kind of sweeps into one bucket things that are legitimate, things that aren't, things that might be partially legitimate. And now it's even got more confusing because if you look at the FTC rule, for example, on auto dealers, they take things like nitrogen-filled tires that they charge more money for and claim that's a junk fee. The problem with that is not that it's a separate price for nitrogen-filled tires. The problem, if there is a problem, is that nitrogen-filled tires are garbage, right? There's nothing there. It doesn't matter whether it's disclosed separately or bundled in the price if it's a worthless product. And so, so when we talk about junk fees, we can end up confusing ourselves, lumping in things because we want to just apply this label to it, whereas I think it'd be much better to understand risk-based pricing. What are things where they're pricing for something that you get no value from? What are the things where they're pricing things simply to extract wealth from consumers and the like?
So would you how would you define something that falls into each of those different categories with different labels?
Me?
Yeah.
Well, what I've tried to say is that we can look at the context in which these arise. So, for example, mandatory fees.
Yeah.
Any mandatory fees should be strongly presumptively disclosed up front. There may be scenarios that I can't think of where that may be the case. That's the only reason I'm hedging. Things that are near mandatory may be like that, right? Like credit card surcharging might be an example. So I would start with that. I would also think about what exactly is the market failure, which is, is it the problem that's disclosed too late in the process? Is the problem that this fee is for a worthless service, right? Or is it something that seems to be doing some work in terms of allocating the cost of using a product or a service to the person actually using it, like a late fee does, for example, on credit cards?
Ms. Greenberg, do you have a view on that? Both the questions that I asked?
Sure. Senator Sullivan, I think, and we think that a good working definition of junk fees is unnecessary, unavoidable, or surprising charges.
So to Mr. Professor Zawicki's point, mandatory, you think that's a good one? I mean,
the example that I used in my testimony is a mandatory resort fee that you are presented with when you check out of a hotel. It's often a daily fee. It could be $35. I've seen them as high as $75 for services that you didn't use, or internet service in some cases, the swimming pool, the fitness center. They're required, and I'm one of those consumers who always ask the hotel to take it off my bill, but they consider them mandatory, and you have no choice. So no, they are not disclosed up front, and so you can't comparison shop when you're looking for a hotel room.
Okay, good. Let me ask, the White House has been talking about this. We want to make sure we get it right as well. They often tout the junk fee issue in the context of fighting inflation. Like, my view is they have a whole host of other areas where they can really fight inflation, right? Like maybe not driving up energy costs on American families, and the Federal Reserve blew the inflation issue a long time ago. But they do add to certain costs, like the example you just gave. Is this really like more of a transparency issue, or do you think that kind of trying to bring this into fighting inflation is a stretch that seems, like a little bit of junk fee false advertising from the White House, maybe? I'd like both of your views on that as well, Professor.
Yeah, this obviously has nothing to do with inflation. It has nothing to do with inflation. The cost is the cost, right? Colloquially, I even said earlier, we say bags fly free on Southwest. Bags don't fly free on Southwest, right? There's a cost for bags. The bag fee is either separated out and paid by people who use the bags, or the cost is bundled into the ticket. There's empirical evidence that shows, as I said earlier, that the price of a ticket on Southwest is higher because you are paying for your free bags and your free cancellations and everything else. So the cost is the cost, whatever the cost is. It has nothing to do with inflation. And so what it has to do with is what is the right level of transparency, and really what is the scheme of pricing that will help consumers in the end find the products they want at the lowest prices. And sometimes that means unbundling the prices. Sometimes that means bundling the prices. Sometimes that means you get bundled prices like in Southwest together with unbundled prices with United, and you get different consumers using different things and that sort of thing. And so that's really what this is about. The bottom line is, what we should care about is, are consumers getting the lowest price for what they're actually using? And everything, in my view, should be allocated towards that end. Transparency is not an end in itself. This has nothing to do with inflation.
Professor Greenberg, does this have anything to do with inflation? Or?
I think certainly it does, because when consumers are asked to pay additional prices for mandatory fees, let's say in a hotel, but this also hits lower income consumers. The junk fees on consumers, we'll go with that term. I think it's very descriptive, very punishing. And what it means is, if you're renting a property or you're applying to rent properties, you're paying a cost on each one of those rental applications. That's money that doesn't go for groceries, that doesn't go for childcare, that doesn't go for utility bills or gas. So this does have an inflationary effect in our view. And you asked about the effect on the economy. Well, $12 billion in credit card junk fees is what the credit card companies and banks are making off late payments by families. And the airline industry collected $102.8 billion in ancillary fees. They call them ancillary fees in 2022. So it has a big effect on the economy.
Good. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Senator. I've got a couple more questions, so we'll maybe call it a second round. If somebody walks in, we'll ask more. Ms. Greenberg, I don't know if you have polling, or, I mean, how widespread do you feel is this aggravation people feel from surprise fees, junk fees, however you want to call them?
Well, I quoted from a Consumer Reports article. They said 89% of consumers who were polled said that they have encountered junk fees. They are pervasive. They are across industries. We talk, about banks and airlines and to some extent rental car companies, although I will say with rental car companies, they have begun an all-in pricing model, which we used to sit with them and complain, I don't know what I'm getting charged for. What are all these convenience fees and delivery fees? And now they've gone in, you can actually price compare when you rent a car, and I very much appreciate that. But the scope of these fees is massive and growing, and it's a huge profit center for industries, and they have not lost, that has not been lost on so many of the industries, and so we're seeing them proliferate.
Yeah, certainly oftentimes many industries in anticipation of legislation move to be in compliance before the legislation is passed. It doesn't mean you still need that legislation, because then they will backslide. I was in the restaurant business for almost 20 years, and there used to be a restaurant called Soapy Smith's, which was named after an early settler of Denver, Colorado, who would sell soap, and these little packages of soap, which were half again more expensive than other soap. But in a crowd, as he was selling the soap, someone would open, one of his friends would open a container of soap, and there'd be a $1 bill in there. And he'd go, "Oh my gosh, look at me, this soap's amazing." And all of a sudden there'd be a run. That's the opposite of a surprise fee. It's a surprise delight. And I think in many ways, as a small business person, we were always trying to figure out how to create, and not with surprise fees, but create more delight or some more positive experience, some level of joy, so that we could charge more money and that people would feel good in the transaction. And I think that's part of what you guys have all been talking about, is that the businesses providing these services and products will do better long run with more transparency. And sometimes one does have to legislate. Things like seatbelts don't naturally come, those kinds of changes aren't always embraced at the very beginning, but in the end, they increase more sales. Dr. Morowitz, I wanted to ask you a little bit on, you talked somewhat about the way consumers perceive that sudden increase in price, and that they think if they go back through the whole process again, they don't recognize, I think you said they don't recognize how much savings they would actually have, and that they feel that they would end up somehow come out on the short end of the stick. Can you go into that a little more and talk about some of the other issues around consumers in their as Ms. Greenberg said earlier, in the busyness of their lives, how they get shortchanged and having to deal with these late stage price increases?
Sure, absolutely. And I also just wanted to comment on a previous question. I do think inflation plays a role here, because I think the firms are under pressure to raise their prices. Consumers don't want to see the prices rise, so they use hidden fees as an implicit price increase to deal with inflation. But to your question, my research has identified several reasons why consumers in this kind of situation complete the purchase instead of restarting. First, sometimes the fees are obscured in such a way that consumers don't even notice them or realize they've been assessed. So this might happen if they're in the small print or not presented at all and just show up maybe later in a bill, or it's embedded in a total on your credit card statement and maybe you don't even notice. Second, even when consumers do notice these fees and they see that the total is more than they initially thought, once hidden fees are revealed, and thinking about whether to restart search, the consumers think about the costs and benefits of restarting. And my research has shown that consumers think the cost, the time of starting search all over again, is longer than it really is. They also think that the benefits, how much money they could save, is less than it really is. And one of the reasons they think there's few benefits to restarting search is because they often believe that if the current firm uses hidden fees, well, then most likely all the other competitors do too. But that's not always the case. And even when the competitors do assess similar hidden fees, the fees may be different. They may go by different names. They may be different amounts. And all this makes search difficult and confusing for consumers. There's other reasons too. Sometimes the fees are presented in a way that makes them look like a tax. Sometimes they're even grouped together with taxes, giving the impression there's no way to avoid them. For many websites, consumers actually have to click on an arrow to open up an option labeled something like taxes and fees to see the details. And then even when they open them, the label may sound like a tax. For example, your cell phone bill may include a federal or state universal service charge, which sounds like a tax, but really represents the cost the cell phone company must pay to support universal access. But then they pass it on to customers in a way making it sound like a tax. Or a rental car company may group with taxes an airport concession recovery fee, which represents their cost to operate out of an airport, but they pass it on to customers, making it sound like a tax customers have to pay to rent a car from an airport. And then finally, as I mentioned before, consumers are sometimes put under pressure by the firm that uses hidden fees to complete the purchase with these countdown clocks and the scarcity queues that we talked about before. So consumers might then be reluctant to restart search, believing that those tickets may be gone if they decide to look a little more. And then they might be gone at the end if they say they still want them. So those are some of the many reasons why consumers often stick with an offering even after hidden fees and a more expensive total are later revealed.
You know, the thing I would add to that we've heard from roundtables, especially with older consumers, when they're working online, there's a level of frustration where they get to a certain point and they are faced with higher price, and they really are reticent to going back through the whole process because they find it so frustrating and many times consuming. We heard that from a number of people. My last question, Professor Zawicki, and I welcome you to come be the visiting professor at University of Colorado, right?
Absolutely, go
Just want to make
Buffs.
sure we get that out in the record. Yeah, go Buffs.
Professor Prime, you can call me.
That's the new football coach is Coach Prime, is Deion Sanders. But just want to make sure everyone's aware of the allusion. Professor Zawicki, what are the examples of sectors where the upfront pricing of products and services is most effective in terms of informing customer choice?
Where it's most effective?
Where the upfront pricing of products is most effective, most successful.
Yeah, I'll just take a brief second to elaborate on something Professor Morowitz said, which I think it may dovetail with Senator Klobuchar's concern about markets and market power, which is that she talked about people don't restart searches, and I think that I wouldn't be surprised if that was especially a problem in markets, say, like Ticketmaster, right, where you essentially have market power. What's the point of restarting the search if there's no other firms really out there competing? And there is some evidence that that this can be a bigger problem than more concentrated markets. And so I think there is a dovetailing there. And I think she also mentioned on the inflation point, just to clarify, I think she's right that inflation does create pressure to do this. A part that has to do with taxes, for example, which is, as I mentioned in my testimony, there's a 7.5% excise tax on a airplane ticket, but there's no tax on a bag fee. So if ticket prices rise simply because of inflation, tickets rise an additional 7.5% for every dollar on an airplane ticket, which puts more pressure to try to adjust untaxed things, and that's a whole sort of separate question. With respect to your question, my general observation is that that industries and firms tend to give consumers what they want. I mean, the classic example is Amazon Prime. Right? If you want a classic example of essentially all-in pricing, $129 for Prime, and you get all this stuff, whether you use it or not, right? But things vary over time. It used to be you got a whole bunch of cable packages, and people got tired of paying for cable channels they don't want. So now we're seeing unbundling. My guess is we'll probably see bundling. It's a process that goes back and forth because bundling is convenient for people. Upfront pricing is convenient for people, but sometimes people say, well, I don't really use that. I don't pay for that. So then you start getting these tendencies toward unbundling. So generalizing is something I'm very squeamish about doing in these markets, as opposed to looking at the combination of prices and terms and trying to figure out whether they make sense in particular context.
Absolutely. Well, I appreciate all of your time and all of your work. You have each been working on this for years and years and years, and it's funny how there are cycles, whether it's bundling and unbundling or just people paying attention to these surprise fees or just accepting them blindly. But I think we are coming to that point where we're going to go into a new period where I think we will get to pretty much everything being transparent, and that that customers will have a better, feel more confident that they're getting a fair opportunity to get what they want at the price of what they expect. Any final statements? Have I overruled somebody's thought as it was coming out?
I might just have one last thought, which is I do think the internet has made this more of a problem, which is this desire of internet merchants to make their costs look cheap up front, right, on the Google search or whatever, and then hit you with fees on the back end. I think that does create a particular dynamic here, and I think it's particularly a problem for small businesses because that's, I think, a process that the larger businesses probably can figure out how to game a little bit better. So I think that is an issue.
Well, and you're not even talking about the context of AI, and it's that's going to be a separate hearing, but that's coming. Anybody else? That last statement?
I would just say that all-in pricing is good for competition and helps consumers and helps honest businesses who are trying to provide the kinds of services you were talking about, Senator. And that's why it's so important that the legislation that we've talked about here get close to passage. As you said, sometimes those pressures inspire changes among industry players. But thank you for holding a hearing on something that is increasingly a problem for consumers, and we look forward to questions on the record.
You bet. Dr. Morowitz, last comment?
Yes, I agree. I think all-in pricing is something that benefits consumers, no matter their party. It benefits honest businesses, no matter their leanings. It helps competition. It helps small businesses. I think this is a very straightforward issue.
Great. Thank you very much. Thank all of you. Appreciate you spending the time. This is going to conclude our hearing for today. I want to thank my colleagues, both who are here and were online. Obviously, our witnesses, I'll thank you again and again and again. The hearing record will remain open for questions for 2 weeks until June 22nd, 2023. Any senator who would like to submit questions for the record may do so until then. We ask that witnesses submit their responses to those questions by July 6th, 2023. With that, the committee is adjourned.